You're listening to the Yoga Medicine Podcast. I'm your host, Tiffany Cruikshank. Our podcast brings you information and resources to enhance the therapeutic effects of your practice based on a deeper understanding of anatomy, physiology, and the integration of modern science and research with traditional practices and experiences. Join me and my co-hosts, Rachel Land and Katja Bartsch, as we dive into all things yoga, research, and wellness. Welcome back. We are here to talk about menopause and perimenopause a little bit. Hopefully having some interesting discussions around a bit more about the experience of menopause and perimenopause, which I think we're starting to get more information on. I think people are starting to talk about it more, but there's still a lot of questions and confusions, I think, about really the experience of how we feel and experience the transitional phase of our lives as females going through perimenopause and menopause as well. And also a nice precursor to our menopause course coming up. We have a full course coming up specifically on menopause and perimenopause, and a breakdown of the research and the science that we have as of now, and also looking at it through a Chinese medicine lens to how we can individualize our approach through a yoga lens to work with and support females as they go through this phase of their lives, because a good percentage of our population will at some point. So it's a good one to be prepared for. So let's get into it and start talking about just a little bit of the background here.
Yeah, I'm excited to talk about this for sure. And as you mentioned, a big part of the population goes through it. And then, if we think about now with the life expectancy today, how long we are in a state of transitioning through menopause and then being in a postmenopausal state and understanding how we experience those phases takes up like a big chunk of our female lives. Looking at like 80 years of average life expectancy, there's like 40%-ish of your life you remain in that phase. So I think it's really relevant for many, many people and a big part of our population to understand that experience and talk about it, which I think is now happening more, luckily.
Right. And it's such a big part of our lives. And for some people, it involves a great deal of change. And for others, very little, or maybe almost none for some lucky few. And so it is really different from person to person, which I think is an important part to also keep in mind as well.
Yeah, I definitely think that's like the big thing we need to stress and we need to mention at the beginning of those conversations, that individually, on each person's individual experience level, the symptoms that one goes through or how one perceives that transition and then the later stages in life also can be so different. So all the things we're talking about today and most of the things that you find in the research will look at aggregated data, so subgroups or groups of people, because that's just how research in the majority of cases works, or we have to look at the aggregated data to some degree to be able to understand on a broader level the symptoms, the prevalences, so how often certain symptoms occur and at what rate. And that's just what research does. And we'll look at some of those data today, but also we want to reiterate over and over and over again that, as you just mentioned, it can be so different from person to person, the sequence of things, symptoms they go through, but overall the general experience as well.
Well, and I think, on the clinical side of that too, it can make it really difficult to treat and work with. And I think whether you're male or female, there are some natural changes happening around this midlife phase. I think I always have this visual of like a plant, and I think it's so obvious with a plant, if we don't water it and give it the nutrients that it needs in the sunlight, that it's going to not thrive at some point. And that's different for every plant. And it's kind of similar with humans, though we don't think of it that way, but what we put in and, things like movement and sunlight and nutrition, all of these things that we do to ourselves over time, and stress levels, we know all the things are having an impact on us. And, in midlife, some of those things can catch up with us. We've had longer in our lives for that stuff to catch up with us. And, so I do think as a clinician, as someone, working with people one-on-one, yourself included, I know you kind of look at more of the research lens when we do these talks, but we both are working with people one on one. But in that clinician side, it does make it difficult to treat, to know what is perimenopause, and we're not necessarily going to talk about that, but I think understanding how how many of these symptoms could be perimenopausal or menopausal related, though they can also be related to other things, especially in this midlife time, is really interesting. And up until this point, a lot of these symptoms have been brushed off, or maybe not correlated with menopause, or maybe not correlated with each other. So I think the more we can understand the symptom pattern, it sounds really basic, but I think understanding that symptom pattern is really essential for understanding the person that we're working with too.
Yeah, fully agreed. And I think what you just said there, two things I want to come back to are so important. I mean, one thing is that, yes, menopausal symptoms have been acknowledged in the medical field or in the medical literature for decades. So sometime in the 1930s, that was first noted or acknowledged in guidelines, etc. But since then, the clinical description of menopause symptoms, for a while at least, hasn't advanced too much. But now in the last couple of years, that's what we've been seeing. And that's what's currently being looked at, is to understand what you just said, like those different clusters of symptoms and which symptoms may go together. So we can maybe predict symptom groups better, or we can specialize or specify treatments better and not have it as general. So that's what's happening in the research right now, and I think that is very, very exciting. And also, I want to come back to that plant analogy, which I like or loved, because it's not just what's maybe in the soil and what the plant consumes on a daily basis, but it's also the sunlight, where you place it maybe, and then also, at least with trees, I know of, that there is talk that trees are talking to each other. So there's maybe a social aspect between plants also. And maybe transferring that and bringing that back to humans makes it a bit, yeah, more graspable. But we understand today also that the menopausal experience goes so beyond biological changes. It's now so well understood already. That's one thing we already understand quite well, that psychological and also social aspects interact with that experience so much. So, for example, we know that there are differences in the experience of symptoms between different ethnicities or ethnic groups. So, one example would be that it's known that women of Asian descent, they experience vasomotor symptoms, so hot flashes and night sweats, at a lesser extent compared to, for example, women of American African descent, for example. Or we know that Caucasian women undergo or experience psychological symptoms at greater rates. So we already know a couple of those things, but there's still a lot of things that we don't understand yet. And luckily, there's some very current research that we'll talk about today that sheds a bit more light on those different, yeah, clusters of symptoms, and also very new perspectives to look at certain symptoms and experiences that are being reported by women.
Well, and I think just the reminder too that I mean, you already kind of mentioned this, but that our genetics are obviously playing a role in that. I know, a lot of times you can look to your mother's experience of menopause to get an idea, but then also remembering that all these other things are playing a big influence on it. All the things we do or don't do, the movement or lack of movement, the nutrition, the stress, the how we perceive it too. I love this too. I think this connection to how we view aging, I think, is a really big thing with the menopause experience, in impacting our symptoms of this value associated with age, which is harder to find now in cultures, but used to be part of, and still is to some extent part of, Mayan culture and Japanese culture more. I think with everything so virtual now, that's probably changing a little bit, but this value that we used to ascribe to aging, especially as a female, and now kind of changing and seeing our value for as a society as females, seeing that value as diminishing, and the way that we see our value and our worth associated with our age, I think, can be a really significant factor, not just on vasomotor symptoms, hot flashes, night sweats, but also on mood symptoms and, subjective quality of life symptoms associated with this time of life for sure. So, um, yeah, there's so much to it, right? The plant analogy, I think, brings that all home. That it's genetics, it's biologic, it's cultural, it's social, it's physiological, it's all the things. So hormonal, of course. Yeah.
Yeah, I'm fully with you there. And I think that social aspect is also so interesting. And there's a couple of articles, research articles that also look at that. So the social aspects, for example, like you mentioned, with the different cultures that perceive or view that process more as going into a wisdom phase. And I know you've talked about that and with regards to traditional Chinese medicine also, which I just love. And I hope that having conversations like this one and generally that people are talking more about menopause, perimenopause, postmenopause now is also contributing to that. So maybe shifting the perspective in our Western culture a little bit, which at the moment is maybe perceiving that transition only with or more with disadvantages or is not positively looking at that transition. Maybe there's even some fear towards it at some point or in some. And I hope that talking about it more just also contributes to normalizing symptom experience and validating people's experience. And I think that can, in the long run at least, make a big change. And I think that's one of the exciting things of it, that we are in that generation or in a phase where we're right in that moment in time to normalize that conversation by talking about it. So that's what we're here for
Yeah.
today as well.
Yeah. I feel like I feel like I've talked about it a lot, but maybe I haven't on the podcast. But I do think, through that TCM lens, the importance of just us seeing this as a phase of wisdom. In Chinese medicine, it's seen as like this the cessation of menses as a way of conserving energy. It's a wisdom phase. It's moving into this more intuitive phase of our lives. And I think most of us can connect to this. I think, I know as someone in my mid 40s now, who's also now divorced and single, you see that there are things that are changing, but also that I don't know about people listening, but I would never want to have to go back to like being a 20-year-old again and not having the wisdom that I have now. There's something about being in your 40s and probably even more in your 50s, maybe, about caring less about what other people think. And there's, I think, a wisdom and intuitiveness to that as well. And it's easy to pull away from that when we look at the media and we look at what society tells us about aging and all of these like cures for aging and these things that we should be doing to kind of turn back time. But the reality is that if we're lucky enough to live long enough, at some point things are going to change. And there is a value in that wisdom as females and as males that we have as we go through our lifespan that we used to appreciate more in cultures where, wisdom was passed down from person to person, within a smaller, more maybe tribal kind of setting. And there was more appreciation for wisdom that had to be passed down. And now we can get it from the internet. But there's still value in that wisdom in so many ways in our life experience. And again, I hope the people listening to this too feel that as well, that, we wouldn't want to exchange for the wrinkles, the wisdom for the wrinkles. But yeah, but again, back to kind of this variety of symptoms that can show up as a part of this transition let's say, along with the wisdom within the transition as well. We'll leave that aside for now, but don't forget that it's there.
Yes. We'll definitely keep the wisdom in mind. And we use that to kind of change the narrative around the whole packaging around symptoms and the cultural perspective of it. And we'll keep it in mind as we go. So yeah, focus has been a bit more now in the research, which I mean, honestly, also has a harder time of capturing maybe that wisdom aspect and the cultural aspect than looking at the biomedical aspects. It's a bit easier to grasp also, but still we only are starting to get a better grasp on those menopausal symptoms because they have been a bit neglected in the research, but now are gaining more attention. And I brought two articles today, which I would like to include or discuss, and which we'll, of course, also link to in the show notes. One is brand new, basically. It's from 2025 from Aras and colleagues. And they used our modern world, internet and all, based on data from apps. So maybe some of you listening are using apps where you can note down your menstrual cycle symptoms, or also then your menopausal transition symptoms. And that's what they've used. And that, of course, is a new way to approach this. It wasn't possible a couple years ago. And that way, of course, you can also have many, many symptom logs and look at a wide variety of people. And that study specifically included more than 140,000 symptoms that have been logged, and in more than 5,000 users. They only looked at people that also logged some symptoms. So if they just logged onto the app one time and noted down one symptom and then never again did they look at the app, that data wasn't included. So just people who really kind of dealt with or also noted down their symptoms. So there's a bit more gravitas to it, maybe, or seriousness in using the apps. And that data informed kind of clusters that were experienced before menopause, premenopause, then in perimenopause, and also in postmenopause. And I just wanted to bring this study to show that the research is really making an effort to understand how women experience their transition on a daily basis. So it's not just filling in a questionnaire once upon a time, but really how they experience that over a longer period of time, how they note that down on a maybe daily basis, or at least every couple weeks or so. And we have new data now with new approaches. And I think that's great to inform our understanding of such symptom clusters there.
Which makes me happy that they're using some of that data that people are putting into the apps. We talked about that on our last episode. Yes. Yay.
Yeah, that's right. And I mean, if we honestly, if we look then at the symptoms that are reported, if you're trying to group them together, you won't be too surprised that in the women who were still premenopausal, the symptoms that they noted were related to the menstrual cycle. That was to be expected. But they also included many women in peri and postmenopause. And they then try to kind of group together some of the symptoms. And it's maybe also not so surprising that in perimenopause, the hot flashes came up, oftentimes then together with vasomotor symptoms. But also they acknowledged, for example, that symptoms such as dizziness or vertigo and some heart specific aspects maybe went together. So, and those are some of the symptoms that are not as often talked about, or they also noted down sexual symptoms. Wasn't specified to the like tits and bits what exactly was all included in there, but maybe less libido or other aspects related to sexual function. But it's, I think, great that, and this was published in a well acknowledged journal, that they are including also those less talked about symptoms such as dizziness or sexual aspects in their symptom clusters. And I think that alone already, again, gives you a bit more validation if you're experiencing that yourself, or also in our understanding as yoga teachers or healthcare providers, that we are aware of that broad range and that some of those symptoms may also go together or not, depending on the individual. But we have, or our puzzle piece picture of possibilities of symptoms and experiences becomes a bit more complete, maybe, or a bit more colorful.
Yeah, and I think with this one, it was interesting to see because they actually had, like, for each category, some top symptoms and some like common clusters. So for perimenopause, what were the top symptoms that they had?
Yeah, so that was hot flashes and night sweats, what you would probably have expected, but also fatigue. Fatigue is not as often talked about. And then also headaches and bloating, and those, depending on who your healthcare provider is, they may be taken very seriously or not. And so those were the top five. So also things that are maybe more on a day-to-day basis. You could ascribe them to other things, of course, also not just to hormonal changes, but those were the top 5 in perimenopause.
Yeah, and I
And then
think the
in post,
headaches one was really surprising to me. That
Mhm.
was, I mean, to be in the top 5 for perimenopause, I think that's one that doesn't really get associated a lot with perimenopause. So I think that was
Yeah,
interesting.
we have to say that was also in within the top 5 of the premenopausal ones. So that's something they came away with, that
Mm,
in perimenopause you can experience symptoms that are more associated with the postmenopausal phase, but also you can still experience all kinds of symptoms that are more associated with the menstrual cycle. So you're really in between, and you can really experience symptoms that are maybe a
right?
bit more related to both those aspects. So
We're in that like
headaches
in
also,
between phase. Yeah.
we're in the in between phase.
We're in
That's
the in
it.
between phase. But what were the so what
Yeah.
were the 5 for premenopause? So premenopause was
Fatigue, bloating, cramps, headaches, and anxiety.
so fatigue, bloating, headaches, still in the same top 5 for pre and perimenopause.
Exactly.
Anxiety surprises me that I feel like that would have been a top 5 for perimenopause more than headaches,
Yeah,
but
and we'll see
interesting.
in the next study. And of course, if you're interested about our training, also we will dig a lot deeper into all the psychological aspects. Also, that of course can also play a big role in perimenopause and keeps us aware that it really depends on study design, what kind of measures were being evaluated, and we have to keep that in mind also. So don't take that as an absolute, and be aware that anxiety, for example, or also depressive symptoms can also come up in the later phases as well. And we will see in postmenopause, it is noted as one of the top 5. So in this one study, it wasn't in the top 5 in perimenopause, but in postmenopause, and let me just maybe list the top 5 there. It came back. So in postmenopause, it was fatigue again, hot flashes, anxiety, joint pain, and brain fog. But and keep that caveat, it really at the moment is not a conclusive picture that we can throw over all of the peri and postmenopausal population, because in the study we'll talk about in a minute, we'll see that, for example, some other studies find that brain fog may be more related to the perimenopausal phase, and may then disappear in the later phases of postmenopause for some. So that's exactly, it's frustrating sometimes if you
Yes.
have pieces of research that for the moment contradict each other, but it also shows that, and I feel I keep repeating myself on this podcast, but I also think that we pick topics that are really timely and up to date, and those are just the fields where the research is developing at quite a big rate, and that's what's happening here as well. So at the moment we're putting together puzzle pieces, and the picture might still be a bit distorted because we just don't have the full picture yet, and that's exciting, but also sometimes confusing. And it probably will
Mm,
also always remain that to some degree.
yeah. I think I'd be curious too. I think one thing we miss in the research is the granularity of it. I wonder how much in the perimenopause symptoms with bloating is probably very different than the bloating in the premenopause, which is my assumption is the bloating that people are experiencing in the perimenopause is maybe more the weight gain that people tend to experience in perimenopause and the changes in metabolism that tend to happen around that time. And you know, probably some bloating too, a cyclical bloating that can happen. Obviously, things are changing and estrogen levels are going up and down and all over the place. So, you know, it can be
Could,
different cycle to cycle. I definitely think from my experience, clinical experience, I would probably put brain fog in there and anxiety in there and maybe less headaches and I'd probably put weight gain instead of bloating for people. I think those are the most common complaints that I hear of
mhm.
for people for perimenopause. But yeah, I like the joint pain coming up more postmenopausal. And yeah, and sometimes the brain fog going away for a lot of people postmenopausal, I find. So I feel like the brain fog can be a trickier one. For some people, it's worse pre or peri. For some, it's worse. I think for more people, in my experience, it's worse perimenopausal than postmenopausal, but the fatigue is real throughout. I mean, we saw that peri, post, the fatigue. And again, there's a lot of other things that can correlate to these. And I do feel like it's easy to dump all of this into the hormonal bucket and to assume that this is all hormonal based, but also to remember that everything is influencing our hormones. So our hormones are being influenced by things other than just our follicles, so how many follicles we have left. But I think it's also influenced by so many things, especially when we talk about fatigue. If we do a differential diagnosis of fatigue, the list is like endless, especially around midlife. I mean, so I think it's interesting to look at and to see and to get an idea of things that could be hormonally caused so that we can get a better idea of what's going on, but to keep our minds open as well. Um,
And
yeah,
that's,
so we saw,
if I might add to that, and that's exactly what this data would be used for also. So data
yeah,
like that is often used to inform future research. So I loved your example of the bloating in pre versus maybe a bloating in perimenopause, and that's exactly an outcome that could be provided by a study like this. So a future study may look at this data and say, the bloating in the premenopause, if we look at it from a mechanistic standpoint, could be influenced potentially by very different things than in perimenopause, where other things come into play. Let's look at that difference. Maybe we can identify what exactly is going on. And that's exactly what this type of data is supposed to provide. So it's not giving you a list of everything and a granularity that reflects each and everyone's experience in peri or postmenopause, but it's to get a bit more granularity into the research, which we don't have right now. So I loved your takeaway from this and the questions that arose in your reflection of this research piece, because that's exactly what is not understood yet. And that's exactly what we want to understand. And this is basically like the jump off point, or studies like this are a jump off point for the future. And I think that's just a comment I wanted to make, because with so many new articles coming out in the research, and maybe our listeners also looking at some of those that are also maybe then featured on social media, having that context and that perspective, what some of that research pieces or those research pieces are able to provide and not provide is, I think, helpful to get like a big picture view of the topic.
yeah. So with the clusters, I think we had a couple already. So we had dizziness and vertigo and heart symptoms like palpitations being a cluster. We had sexual symptoms, so libido as well as function and pain. We had hot flashes and night sweats, which is kind of an obvious one, I feel like. And then there were a few others, I think, too. So
Yeah, we had
those were
mood
all
and
in
cognitive.
perimenopause. And were those all? Those were
Yeah,
all in both. Yeah. So those were all both in peri and postmenopausal
yeah,
clusters.
they're kind of similar, or kind of go together. In the postmenopause, in this one, they also reported chills, and in the perimenopause, they reported those menstrual cycle associated, potentially associated symptoms, which then went away in the postmenopausal phase. But yeah, so mood and cognitive also were happening or reported in both, and they might be an interesting transition into the next study, unless you want to talk about those a bit more.
I think mood and cognitive is an interesting one. I mean, it's an obvious one, but also really interesting to see that association between cognitive function like brain fog and anxiety and depression, and how those could be correlated. Again, there's not a causative factor. We're just looking at correlation here, but also these digestive symptoms that come up. And I think for a lot of females, these do come up in perimenopause as well, as postmenopause, but I think these were shown more in postmenopause with flu-like achiness kind of symptoms, which is an interesting cluster, I think, as well. The flu-like and digestive symptoms kind of going together, which again, we're just talking about correlation, so more to come. But yeah, in
Yeah,
10 years.
fingers crossed. Yeah, but with the current attention on the topic, I'm positive we will know a lot more.
Yeah.
Yeah. And why don't we hop over to the next study, which I think to some degree at least reflects that relationship or potential correlation between mood and cognitive changes in some cases or to some degree. And I found this one really, really informative and an interesting new angle. And it is about the sensation or experience of not feeling like myself in perimenopause, which many women experience or report in clinical practice. And then now the research has picked up on that. Do you want to add to
I
the
mean, I
intro
think this
here?
one's so interesting. I'm so excited about this because I think it's such a common one. And I think there's a couple of reasons for this. One, I do think, especially outside of our yoga bubble, it's not uncommon for people to have a low level of body awareness and to just know that something is different. I think there's that category, but I think there's also a category of people who maybe don't have really obvious symptoms like hot flashes and night sweats where they just know though that they feel different. I've experienced this. I don't really have a lot of symptoms myself, but I do feel a little different. And I have, with the stuff we talk about with Chinese medicine, have consciously tried to tie that to it's not a bad thing. Like this is a powerful transition and trying to like really promote that positivity around it. But I can sense that things are different and that can be okay. And maybe that's not a bad thing, or maybe it's not something that I need to fix or change. Maybe it is. I need to dig deeper, right? We need to ask more questions with the people we're working with, of course. But I think it's a really common experience for females in this time, in this like 10-year period before menopause, which again, some people have very little symptoms, to have that like something just feels different and to acknowledge it and to appreciate it, I think kind of changes things too. It changes the experience a little.
Yeah. So, do you want me to dig into the study?
Yes, go.
Yeah. I'm going. So all that you beautifully described from your own experience is something that not only individuals have expressed, but on a clinical level has obviously gotten as much attention because many women express this. So it's really a common thing for women in perimenopause or right in that menopausal transition, expressing that they're not feeling like themselves. And then for healthcare providers, but also for us as yoga teachers, for us as individuals, as females, it's sometimes hard to grasp that, like, or hard to put a thumb on it. Like, what is that? What do we mean that by that? And what could that include, or what could that be related to? And that's what this study did. So they did that, or they looked at that sensation experience of not feeling like myself to understand women better, to again validate their sensations, their experience, for example, to empower them also in their interaction with healthcare providers, etc. So that was kind of like the starting point for the study. And it's by Kozlov and colleagues from 2024, so also pretty current. And that was part of or came from the context of the Women Living Better survey. So there are a couple of bigger studies in the field of peri and postmenopause. Yeah, and I'm not going to give you an overview there at the moment, but there's a couple of big studies, and that's one of them, the Women Living Better survey. And they ask for many different things and then look at different data aspects of it. So one question they asked, because they noted that this was relevant in clinical practice, is the question to what degree they didn't feel like themselves over the period of the last 3 months. And at the same time, they also asked for a whole bunch of different symptoms. In this case, it was 61 different symptoms, and also, of course, demographic data. And then they looked how that sensation or experience of not feeling like themselves, how that went together with those other symptoms. And I have to say that in that sample that was looked at, it was over 1,200 individuals that gave the enough data or full data on all of those questions. There's a bit of bias in the data. So the majority of them was college educated, worked maybe not full time, but had like a job. And so there's a bit of bias. We won't be able to extrapolate or generalize that data to everyone, but that's the rough outline of that study. And what they found was, so the first result of that was that a whole almost 17% not felt like themselves for all of the last 3 months, which I think is already quite a lot.
Wow.
Like 17% almost not feeling like themselves all of the time for the past 3 months. And then over 63% reporting not feeling like myself for at least 50% of the time or more. So at least 50% of the time or more, over 60% of that sample answered that they didn't feel like themselves. And that, I think, reiterates what you just said. Like, you notice, even if you are not in the self-awareness bubble with the rest of us yogis, that's something that doesn't go unnoticed.
Well, and here's my question too, because I feel like this correlates a lot to age, and I don't know if they had this granularity in there. I mean, one just like mind blown. What a great, powerful study, because there are over 1,200 participants collecting information over 3 months. I think, again, we're only seeing a small. I'm glad that you put that out there, a very specific demographic, but it does give us some interesting insights. My question is like, what are how do we know that they're in perimenopause? How are we deciding that? Is it just like a specific age mark? And then are there postmenopausal people included in this too?
No, this one was only perimenopause. So, and this is, I think, the overall study is bigger. So they have various questions in there to make sure in which phase they are in. I would have to look into the specific methods to
Gotcha.
determine how
And
those different phases were reflected. But those are only perimenopause. So that was
yeah,
clearly determined.
gotcha. Well, and I think too within that, so here's my other question, not for you, it's just a question, is like, I think very different symptoms for people who are early in perimenopause, who probably have a very different cycling pattern than people who are very close to menopause. Maybe they've already gone 11 months without a cycle. We'll still consider them perimenopausal, but they might be acting a lot more like a postmenopausal woman at that point because they haven't had a cycle in 11 months. I just talked to someone the other day who was in their what was it? I think 58, and still hadn't gone through menopause completely yet. And they kept going to that like 11 month, almost to 12 months, and then we'd get one. It's like, so it can be very different for each person. But some people toward the end of perimenopause, those last 5 years could have been, maybe they had, 6 periods, 7 periods, and so I'm exaggerating a little bit, but my point is that I think that can be very different within that phase of perimenopause as well. But 63% 63% of the time to not feel like yourself. I mean, that's significant.
It's a big number. And I have to say, you're ambitious. I mean, I fully agree that within perimenopause, there's also, or can be, a broad range. I was already happy that they specifically looked at perimenopause, because when we look at the sports medicine literature, in many of the studies or outcomes, we are not able to distinguish between perimenopause and early postmenopause yet. And I was happy that they specifically looked at perimenopause, but there's always more granularity.
We always want more. We always want more.
Again, more to come. We repeat ourselves.
We started this talking about how perimenopause can be. I mean, again, some women don't experience symptoms until maybe a year before menopause. So, it may seem very short, but it can be very long. It can be 10 years. And so it can be very different in different parts of that, like a decade of our lives. You can imagine any decade of your life, your experience in that decade is very different at the beginning than the end of it. And is also dependent on the things you're doing or not doing. I mean, I know
Totally.
I felt better when I turned 40, than I did sometimes in my 20s and 30s, so it is just also dependent on other things. But I think this is a really cool study and really interesting to look at. Yeah.
Definitely. So I'm going to read out what kind of symptoms were associated with, so correlated with that sensation of not feeling like oneself. And then we can discuss a bit more in what scenarios or maybe what personality types those different aspects might play a role. And that was then more suggested or hypothesized by the authors. But I'm going to read out the correlations, and I think those are in order of the significance or in order of the strength of the relationship, so the strength of the correlation. So fatigue, being overwhelmed, being one, that was correlated with not feeling like themselves. Less being able to cope, low feelings, anxiety, more nervousness, being irritable, harder time concentrating, difficulty making decisions, feeling like I cannot calm down on the inside, being more forgetful, tearfulness, crying, worrying more. So, and that's why I initially said, oh, that relationship between, or at least that cluster of psychological or mood related symptoms and cognitive symptoms, that they go together, I think comes out quite well in that study, because that was a mix of those things. So a couple of the things were more related to those aspects that we now sum up maybe as brain fog, then also decision making problems, which are typically not so much associated with brain fog, or not as much at least. And then also all those more mood or emotion related aspects as well. So we can discuss a little bit about how those different aspects, mood and cognitive, might impact one's perception or might impact one's experience of not feeling like themselves. But those is like just the list. I don't know if you want to comment on that.
Yeah, I mean, I think the list makes a lot of sense. You hear that and you're like, yes, yes, I get it. I get it. And I'm sure there's a lot of other reasons that can be more physiological too, which can be concerning. But I think the physiological ones like hot flashes and night sweats, you might not feel like yourself with that, but also we can pinpoint them and be like, this is a symptom. This is a symptom of my hormones shifting. And I think it kind of has a lot to do when we're talking about these, symptoms not feeling like myself. It has a lot to do with this concern of not knowing, of not understanding, of being like, am I okay? Is something wrong? I feel off, but I can't pinpoint it. There's not like a thing I can point to. And I think that feeling off can then affect a lot of things. It can affect our sexual relations, our relationships, our confidence, our work, our health. I think there's a lot of different ways that can then also impact, as well as be impacted by all these other things as well. So, I think part of it is just not dismissing it, but acknowledging it, that this is a real important thing to acknowledge and respect is happening, that we are changing. And again, to kind of find ways to befriend it. I think this unconditional regard for this internal presence and awareness we see in yoga is interesting for me during this phase. Like, can I be curious to it, without needing it to change?
Yeah. Yeah. I yes to all that you said. Why don't we I'm gonna discuss what you just said, or bring that maybe also again back to the study. Also sharing just what my, like, currently what I'm starting to have those, I don't want to say memory lapses, but especially like verbal memory, not like either forgetting words or just
Yeah.
saying a whole different word. Like I want to say shoe and then I say umbrella or something, and I don't even notice it. So that's so someone else is gonna tell me like, what shoe? And
You mean shoe?
like what umbrella? And like, so that kind of stuff, which would be probably labeled as brain fog or as memory lapses there. So those are very typical. And noticing that's it's not so much the saying umbrella instead of shoe, but it is the noticing that then of course immediately can become concerning. So I'm like,
Yes.
I'm not used to that. I'm a person I have very, very good memory.
Yes.
I don't have to write down stuff, or I didn't used to have to write down stuff. I know all the things. I don't need to-do lists, and I will still remember everything. I used to, and now it's different, or it's starting to become different. And that worrisomeness of it is
Yes.
probably much worse than the actual forgetting of words. Because if I probably sum them up, or if I would keep track, it's probably not even that severe, but just noticing that change, noticing that things are different now, that then of course you can also feel less in control. You can become maybe concerned that this may lead to more severe impact of cognitive function. And I think that that is one. And in the study, they also address that. So the cognitive changes or challenges, that's like some women may find that most relevant for not feeling like themselves. Because for me, that's a very new sensation. It's a very new feeling. So that's definitely one that's contributing on my end to starting to not feel like myself, because it's very new. So that's one
Yeah.
aspect
Well, and I
that I
think
wanted
that's
to
a really
share.
big one too for people like ourselves who rely on our brains a lot. I feel like as a yoga teacher, I've always really prided myself in like really relying on my brain and not like how I look in spandex and just being like, this is my gift. And then, you come into menopause and you're like, okay, I just made peace with my body and how I feel in my body. I live in spandex all the time and just being, and now my brain is changing. And you're like, what? And I think for people who rely on their brain, I mean, we all rely on our brains a lot, but especially for, teachers or professors or people in situations where, which again I think is everyone to some extent, but we rely on our brains a lot, it becomes more disconcerting. For me, it's more disconcerting than changes in metabolism and things like that, which can come with this time as well. But yes, everyone places different priorities on different things. So the cognitive one, I think, can sneak up on you and be tricky because you can't point a finger at it, right? It's not as easy as like, well, I'm having hot flashes. Brain
Yeah.
fog can be kind of hard to chase down and yeah, point a
Yeah.
finger at.
And then, I mean, also, we mentioned fatigue already, which seems to be present maybe across different life stages, but definitely also appears to play a role in perimenopause. And I think if you're a very active person who is physically active a lot, maybe also, yeah, relying a lot on that physical ability, which I can also easily imagine in a lot of yoga teachers, and then suddenly you're just very fatigued, you have very little energy. Of course, that can also be very frustrating, or that can also contribute to the sensation of not feeling like yourself, right?
Yeah. Again, I think probably one we both relate to. I mean, I know I do as like people who are athletic or people who are in a lot of strength and fitness kind of fitness trainers, yoga teachers. I think this one shows up a lot. I think that struggle with energy can be a really real one. I definitely feel that too. Yeah.
Yeah. And then I think another bucket that also the authors in that article discussed was kind of that new emotional volatility, and then that sensation of being less able to cope because maybe you're tearful or you're feeling low. And then that may, I don't know, maybe not question, but your independence or your previously perceived bravery, but it might um, lead to you perceiving situations differently. I remember that was one of the first social media posts, and that's been like many, many years ago now, from a movement teacher and manual therapy teacher that I know or have been connected on social media. And she was like one of the first ones that I noticed talking about this, that she used to give like those big lectures and presentations, and always was excited about it and looking forward to it. And then there came that time when she entered that transitional phase where she suddenly was scared and felt like a teenager and was really experiencing that for the first time. And that was just her independence that was a given for her, kind of her perceived independence, at least, or bravery, changed because that emotional aspect, that emotional volatility maybe came in. And yeah, I remember that story. So that was
Or
something that I
anxiety, which we talked about
anxiety.
before, right? I mean, like there's so
Yeah,
many different ways. Yeah. Yeah.
they all come
That
in depressive
perceived
symptoms. Yeah.
perceived value changing
Hmm.
and wisdom that we talked about. I think that can influence all of that. Yeah.
Yeah. So I think I really appreciate that in that article they're talking about this, and also on a, let's say, on a rational or researchy perspective, or in that frame, are addressing this, are validating this, and are acknowledging that this phase is really a challenge to one's self-image. And there then other social aspects might also come in. Maybe you behave differently, and maybe then that clashes with some behavioral expectations, maybe in your family setting or in your workplace, and maybe you are sometimes then a new person, and your environment perceives that as well. So I do think that, or I appreciate that so much, that there are efforts to really talk about this, to normalize this, to validate those experiences, and to make it normal that this is a transition. I mean, it's not a transition just for the sake of the word, but it is a transition. And I think we can come out differently on the other end, and that's okay. And I think the frame for that has been present in many different cultures, like you expressed initially today in the introduction, but we're also finally there in our Western cultures to acknowledge that and to talk about it. And I find that so important, and I really value that.
I think anyone who, well, I can't speak for everyone, but I think for a lot of people in this midlife phase, wherever you're at in perimenopause or menopause, it's hard not to feel a sense of, I think, being afraid of being irrelevant. We're going through a phase of changing from this kind of youthful phase of our lives to this wisdom phase of our lives, and things are changing. And I think as a yoga teacher as well, I've definitely experienced this feeling of like newness that sometimes can be perceived as irrelevance. And I think once you start to recognize that your place is changing, for me it's more like, oh, I don't have to be relevant to every person. I don't have to be relevant to a 20-year-old who's doing yoga or a 30-year-old who's doing yoga. I just want to be relevant to the people who can appreciate what I have to offer, who are okay with some word slips, who are like, who can appreciate that I'm human, and that I am still flawed and not perfect, but I still have a lot to offer, and I have the wisdom of a life lived, and we all have things that we have studied and learned up until this point in our lives. We have 40, 50 plus years maybe of wisdom accrued, whatever that be in. We're gaining wisdom from raising children. We're gaining wisdom from our work in business or finance or yoga or whatever that might be. We're gaining wisdom within this life lived that is useful and important, and we have to be able to evolve that. And I think the questioning is a part of this, though. I think for me, the questioning is part of this phase that can be seen in either way. It can be seen as a weakness and irrelevance, and it can be seen as a strength and something that we can potentially lean into. And for me, this is the yoga practices of being able to, for me, the meditation practice has been such a really important part of my practice, maybe more important than my asana practice in this phase of being able to question, of being able to be curious, of I'm obsessed with this phrase now of this unconditional regard for my nervous system, meaning like I can sit with whatever's there, whatever. I mean, I've had some shit storms this last year, so they've been a really good challenge for me, and I have seen it as that good work. But also, alongside all that shit storm was alongside changes of being in my mid 40s too, and the questioning, the imposter syndrome, the irrelevance, the consciousness of maybe my value diminishing, or is it increasing? Am I becoming wise, and am I getting to know myself and understand myself better, or is there a fear around not feeling like myself? And, is it a not feeling like myself, or is myself changing and updating? Am I getting a new system overhaul in this phase of life? Like maybe it's like a whole reboot. Maybe I have a new version of Mac that, the younger users don't get to have just yet. Which, I do think, it is kind of looking at how we see this, and looking at the research around this subject of not feeling like myself, I think is part of that, of acknowledging that this is a time of transition, and it is normal and valid to feel that, not to dismiss it, but that it is part of this transition, of this upgrade of systems and sort. And being able to sit with that, not expecting myself to be as I was before. Why would I want to be? I don't know, but I don't know about you, but yes, dating in my mid 40s has made me realize, that I don't want to date people in their 30s or even their early 40s, probably. I don't have things in common. There's a wisdom that comes with a life lived that I don't want to let go of. And how do I sit with and appreciate that, and the changes that come with that, and this feeling of not feeling like myself, maybe just being an upgrade of systems, and this unconditional regard for my nervous system being, for me, the tool that can help me. It's not going to get rid of my symptoms, right? It's not going to make them disappear, but it allows me to embody the transition. And I think especially this one, because I do think not feeling like myself is such a big part of perimenopause. I would just say that I think pretty much everyone in perimenopause feels like this. I would almost say more than 60% of the time for a lot of people, I think, but those numbers, show us just how important it is to look at.
So eloquently said. I can almost not add anything to it, but I will add one thing that stays with me all the time, has been for a couple of years, but I feel is becoming even more relevant now, and then also in the years to come, which is kind of an equation that I read from a Hawaiian cookbook actually at some point, and it said change equals stress equals growth. And I like to look at it from that perspective. So look at the upgrade aspect of it and not just a reboot. And I think understanding it, to me, always helps. I think for me, it's the frame, the context of the change helps me a little bit to then also just sit with it for me. And I think for many people, that is one aspect of coping, is to understand and to get that frame. And I hope that our conversation today, and also our training that's coming up, will help with that. And make it normal that we talk about this and that we own this phase.
I really love that, just came to me too during this. I love this. I'm gonna hopefully remember. But I love this idea of in midlife or peri and postmenopausal, of having a newer upgraded version of, well, I have a Mac, so of my Mac system. Not necessarily quicker than the other versions, but there's more information there. And we know, you put it in your computer, the more information you have on it, sometimes it does run a little slower, and that's okay. Sometimes, I don't know, about you as a user, I'm willing to wait. Maybe not AOL dial-up waiting, but I'm willing to wait a little bit to have more resources and information at my fingertips. And I think we all experience this, later in life, that we have more resources available to us within that lived experience. And so just hopefully this kind of brings to life to that appreciation for, and also support of, the reality of the change that's happening, of not feeling like myself. Again, yes, that's not to say that it's not something you want to work with if it's concerning, if there are symptoms that you can definitely work with to support with your healthcare provider, or, we'll talk about this in the yoga setting to a great detail later on. We'll talk about all the things in the brain fog and the anxiety and so many other things, all the different parts of the transition, but to also have an appreciation for the fact that this not feeling like myself can also be an upgrade, that things are changing to not go back in a good way too. And to get curious to it, to I think this is such an important time to lean into this unconditional regard for our nervous system, in curiosity, to welcome and appreciate the changes that come with this period. Yeah, not all of them are welcome. Yes, some of them we might seek out a healthcare provider or yoga therapist or yoga therapy for. But I think really important to kind of look at how we see it too, and a really big part of the experience. So thank you for bringing this article. I'm really glad that we had it to look at.
I liked it too. I thought it was a really cool one.
So obviously a lot more information to come. We talk a lot about, all of the details of menopause, of course, the basics like the symptoms and the changes and the hormones and the research, and also looking at how to support different phases of perimenopause and menopause and the changes that can happen, breaking down the very specific changes that can happen and looking at how to work with them therapeutically through a yoga lens in our menopause course. So we've got a lot of information for you there coming up soon. So keep your eyes peeled. It's depending on when you're listening to this, it may not be on the website just yet. Or perhaps it is if you're listening to this later. Check it out at yogamedicine.com. Such valuable work. It's really interesting, I think, to look at these symptom clusters, but also to look at this subjective experience of this process of just changing experience in our bodies. So thanks for bringing the information. And well, I'm sure there'll be more topics, discussions to come on maybe on menopause, but definitely on other wonderful research topics.
There's a couple things we could chat about. Yeah, that's.
As always, thanks for listening. If you loved it, leave us a review. Of course, we love your 5-star reviews, but anything you have to say, we always love to hear it. So thanks for joining us, and we will see you next time.
Till next time.
Thanks for listening to Yoga Medicine. If you like the show, please be sure to subscribe and leave a rating and review on Apple Podcasts or wherever you listen to podcasts. And if you got something out of this episode, please spread the word and share it with a friend. You can find more information, articles, trainings, and classes at yogamedicine.com, or check us out on social media as Yoga Medicine. You can also email us at info@yogamedicine.com. Thank you for being a part of our Yoga Medicine community. We look forward to seeing you again. The content of this podcast is not medical advice and is not meant to replace medical care. Please consult your healthcare provider to determine what is best for your unique healthcare needs.